Thanks everybody for coming, and I'm hoping everything is audible in the other room as well. Extremely pleased to welcome so many people here tonight to come together to understand and celebrate and learn more about this cancer and push it forward as we go forward into 2017, 2018 and such. And we're really happy to share with you tonight recent progress and our ideas for making further progress in the coming months and years. So tonight the presentation is going to be organized based on me giving a few introductions. We've already kind of mentioned some of those things during the dinner, and so I'll keep those pretty brief. A few exciting highlights from this past year, and then we'll invite up a few people who want to say a few words tonight about their experience or their family's experience with this cancer. And Krista's going to talk about the Merck antibody test. A lot of exciting things have happened with that in the past year and should be developing in the coming months even. Candace is then going to talk about the incredibly important role of T cells in fighting this cancer, what we've learned about how we can beat this cancer in some cases using the immune system, and in other cases what we're thinking we're going to do to make a bigger difference going forward. And then Kelly Paulson, who's familiar to many in this audience and has been working on Merkel with us on and off for more than 10 years, is going to tell us about very exciting clinical trials in T-cell therapy. So just to note, if you intend to speak this evening, this presentation will be videotaped and made available for others who can't be here tonight to view online. This is a summary of the folks that really make my daily experience so much fun. Trainees at all levels, from undergrads who are tracking and obtaining the data from all of the patients and how they're doing, to medical students, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, research scientists. And we've had a lot of trainees over the years, over 70 trainees who come from all different kinds of areas, including dermatology, undergrads, postdoctoral fellows, radiation oncologists, et cetera. And there's a wonderful synergy of people and their interests and their expertise and their ages and overlaps. And there's always somebody ready to take any given test, their MCAT or something like that, and people can help each other with that. And then there's also synergy as we work between taking observations in the clinic to the research lab to therapy and back around. And that is really fun and exciting. Always new, always surprising, always dynamic. Sometimes it's hard to focus because there's so many exciting opportunities and challenges, but it's how we're making a difference, I think, in the most powerful way. We have many collaborators on our Merkel cell carcinoma projects, including several who were here tonight, Dr. David Cole, Dr. Aude Chapuis, Dr. Denise Galloway, in particular, who run research labs focusing on T cells and on the immune response in terms of antibodies. This is the team that got together to make that antibody test that Krista's going to talk about tonight that is, we believe, helping every single patient at the time of their diagnosis, figuring out how we're going to track them over time. We have core facilities. Several folks are here tonight from these core facilities, including Rob Pierce, who was recently recruited from academia and then from Merck and then back to academia and at the Fred Hutch. And he's leading our ability to understand what's happening microscopically within the tumors, the immunopathology aspect of things. And the rest of these folks help us track the various tumors and the blood samples, and there are thousands of them, and they all have to be tracked very carefully. Our clinical team, many of you know these folks. They are often seen in the clinic, including our medical oncologists, our surgeons, our radiation oncologists. But some of these folks are not seen all the time. Our pathologists look under the microscope and make sure we're treating patients the right way. And then radiologists and nuclear medicine docs look at the scans and help us make sure we're treating patients in the right way. And of course, our biostatisticians look at the data and help us make sure that we're treating today's patients and the future patients in the right way. Our clinical team also, of course, includes patient care coordinators who are the first contact point for patients who are scared and have a new diagnosis of this and are calling and saying, what's going to happen and when can you be seen and when can we be seen? And it's almost always the answer is within a week, and people are very happy about that. And these folks make sure that all the right records come in. Our nurses, our clinical research team, getting patients onto trials and moving them over to other trials if things don't go as we hoped, et cetera. Our wonderful folks in the academic dermatology office that make sure that we have money in the right places and we're paying people and we're following the right rules to stay out of trouble as we do clinical trials and we manage our grants and such. Christine and Elena are our advancement contacts who are super important in helping an event like this go well and helping us stay in touch with the patients who make donations and other sources of donations that, as I'll tell you, are critical for the progress that we've been making. Here's another interesting piece of our puzzle, and that is, how do we put all this data together? With 1,339 patients and over 160 data points that we try to track for each patient over time, this is a huge challenge. Observing their medical records, grabbing the data from that. The blood and tissue samples all have to be tracked in terms of where they are and how they've been used and what the results are from those studies. Patient updates is an ongoing process every year to track how folks are doing. Because we have done this unique work and we know what the stage of every patient is and what their treatment is, we have the best database for this cancer in the world, without a doubt. And that's very powerful as we try to get more grants and such. And we can do things like this. This is a subtle difference for you, but this is not whether a person is alive. This is whether a person's Merkel has come back or not. And we are the only ones in the world who have this data broken down by stage. And we use this all the time. We've made this publicly available. We use it all the time to say, well, once these lines get really flat for your stage, things are fine. We don't need to be scanning you so often and such. And that data we're going to be making public in the coming months in a publication. And of course, these things all get linked together. You can ask any of thousands of questions to pick this apart. And this has all been supported by, this research is all supported by patient donations. Our industry partners, you can see very recognizable major companies here. The very biggest of the pharmaceutical companies are involved, as are local nearby small companies with just a dozen or two employees. We're extremely happy to partner with all of these. We're asking scientific questions and technology development questions with some, others with, we're doing clinical trials, and we're just so happy that these folks are willing to work with us on a rare cancer that is not going to be generating a big blockbuster drug for them, but clearly can benefit patients and can help with our understanding of the science associated with cancer. Here are the folks that help us with clinical trials here based at the National Cancer Institute, and this team is based in Seattle here, helping us run some of these clinical trials, including the pembrolizumab clinical trial that was published last year. And of course, our funding sources, biggest is the National Cancer Institute, but the first that funded a major Merkel cell carcinoma grant was the American Cancer Society in 2008. And since over that past about 10 years or so, we've had over $8 million in grants, with more in the works, the single biggest one being one we just submitted a couple months ago in May, called Immunobiology and Immune Therapy for Merkel cell carcinoma. This was a program project grant. It's requesting 5 years of funding for a total of $18 million, and it took us a year to put it together, 715 pages. It's a monster involving over 30 people, and it was really an effort. We're extremely excited about the science that's proposed in that. You're going to hear about that tonight in terms of the way that the immune system here for Project 1 recognizes the virus. For Project 2, this is new ways to use one person's solution and their personal immune cure and transfer that into another person. We're calling that sharing cures, and we're going to tell you about how that's happening. And then with Dr. Bhatia here, we're trying to figure out, we're going to talk tonight about the new drugs that are making such a big difference and that were FDA approved and such. And we're trying to figure out why they work in some patients, why they don't work in others, and how we can fix that. And then we have these wonderful cores that are going to make all the science go much better. So we will hear in early November a score and how likely it is that this is going to be funded or not. But even if we do receive this award, we're going to still rely very heavily on our donors, many of you, who have donated over 3,000, given over 3,000 gifts since 2006, totaling over $2.6 million. Here are some of the families that have been touched by Merkel cell carcinoma or that have just felt like supporting research here at University of Washington. And their gifts have made an enormous difference in our ability to push this science forward in multiple ways, including making sure that there's not a short-term stoppage of funding when a particular grant ends, and also ensuring that when we get an exciting opportunity, we've got the $5,000, the $10,000 to take a chance on it and to push things forward. Those have made huge differences. We also need to thank our patients for the hundreds of donations of blood and tumor tissue that have driven our research. This is how big the group was all in one room in 2008. And it's obviously grown a lot, which is very exciting. And we thank our extended families, our personal families. Here's mine. And thank all of you for making it tonight. Last year at this event, we said there will soon, we believe, be the first FDA-approved drug for Merkel cell carcinoma. And of course, I can tell you tonight, and you all I think know this, that did happen. It's called avelumab or Bavencio. We'll be talking to you a little bit about the data tonight and about that event. But here Hannah in the lab baked a Bavencio cake. That's pretty fun. We were all just very excited about this event. And this happened on March 23rd, and Dr. Bhatia was one of the key leaders of this trial. Many of us were involved in it. And there are more immunotherapy drugs expected coming in the near future. We thought it would be kind of fun tonight to do something silly. On that day, in March 23rd, there was a lot of just running around and calling each other and celebrating, and the folks that we've been working with at EMD Serono and Pfizer got on the phone with us. But we thought we'd do something a little bit different tonight, and I asked the team to find something celebratory. And so we have Lance Confetti de Fête, Party Popper. Something celebratory, all right? So I don't know how this is going to exactly work, but watch out. What's that? Point it that way. Okay. All right, are you ready? Let's do a 5, 4, 5, countdown to from 5. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. No. Oh! Okay. All right. Good. All right, and there's another one. Okay! All right, they really said it was dangerous. I don't think it's that dangerous, but all right. Anyway, you got to do something silly every now and then, so thanks for helping us celebrate that event. That I think is a big deal. It was the first drug that EMD Serono had approved in more than a decade. It's a big immune therapy drug for Pfizer and EMD Serono because they partnered. And at the time it was approved, the only thing it was approved for was Merkel cell carcinoma. So super exciting. Now, just a couple months later, it got approved for bladder cancer, and you can bet money they're studying this in many different applications. But we're very lucky that they had some attention and some excitement about Merkel cell carcinoma. So these drugs this drug is approved. There's probably a couple more that will be approved in the coming years. And access is now quite easy for these drugs. The other drugs are already approved for other indications, and there's public data about how they're useful. The bottom line is we are now finally able to move away from chemotherapy. So I want to yeah, okay. I didn't realize that would get a round of applause right there. Let me show you the data comparing chemotherapy to immune therapy. And as you recall, we kind of laughed last year. I used to get on the phone with all these medical oncologists who would just say, yo, you're an idiot. What are you talking about? Chemotherapy is the only thing that you're unethical, And so this was tiresome. Yeah. And so I want to show you the data now that convinced the FDA, and this is progression-free survival, which means your chance of not having your cancer grow again. comparing chemotherapy versus immune therapy. So here's chemotherapy. In patients who had previously received chemotherapy, their cancer grew back, and this is the amount of time then when they got chemotherapy again before their cancer progressed. So you can see only on average about 2 or 3 months before their cancer progressed, and everybody, who start off with 100% not having progressed, by 2 months, most have. By 6 months, everybody in these two trials, these are all independent trials in the United States and Germany, and by 1 year, 100% have had their cancer grow. Now we're going to compare apples to apples here. Here's Bavencio and avelumab. They did this in the setting of people who failed chemotherapy because they felt that's the only way they could really prove this was beneficial. So yes, a lot of people do progress here on the red line. That's not good. But almost half, and eventually by a year, a third, have this thing, we call this a tail on the curve. It stays up. And that did not exist for the chemotherapy part at all. And when we give an immune therapy, not after chemotherapy, but first, and all of these drugs are being tested in that setting, the rates go up even more. So rather than sort of everybody progressing by 1 year, we have half of people doing great at 1 year. Obviously, the glass is half full, half empty. Half have progressed. We have lots of work to do. We're talking to you about that tonight. But overnight, basically, these data have changed the national guidelines. Chemotherapy used to be the only thing listed, and now it is distinctly listed as a second preference only for patients who cannot get immune therapy. So super exciting. The days of the incompetent dermatologist being mocked by the other doctors are mostly over. Okay. All right. So then you immediately come to this question, well, what about giving immune therapy for patients who don't have cancer that's, spread already in their body, but are at a high risk of having it spread? So, for example, these stage 3B patients with known primary tumors have a 70% chance that their cancer will come back within 2 years. But they got surgery and radiation, and at the beginning, you couldn't, right at this time point, there's no evidence of disease, no matter what you do, scan or whatever. You can't find it, but they have a 70% chance it's going to come back. This is called adjuvant therapy, where you give treatment after no evident cancer remains. And it's a very important concept in other types of cancer. It's just being explored in immune therapy now, and it's really not known in Merkel cell carcinoma. These drugs are expensive, they have side effects, and, only 2/3 needed. Not 100% of these patients need it. So Dr. Bhatia has developed a trial with support from EMD Serono and Pfizer to look at adjuvant avelumab in Merkel cell carcinoma. He's calling it the ATOM trial, and it's going to be the first ever randomized trial in Merkel cell carcinoma. They didn't think that a trial could be successfully done in Merkel cell carcinoma. We showed them. Now we're going to try to take it the next step and do it randomized. So it's going to be placebo-controlled in patients who have Merkel that has spread to their lymph nodes. They've gotten their surgery, they've gotten their radiation, and then they get randomized. 50 will get avelumab, and 50 will get placebo. And this, I will point out, is absolutely the standard of care, placebo, and we will be watching the patients very carefully. And if their cancer were to come back, we would be able to give them drug. But some of these patients wouldn't benefit from the drug, and they might have side effects, and this is the right way to ask the question. So we're super excited that EMD Serono and Pfizer are supporting this, and it's going to be run across 14 centers in the United States, and that's just about ready to launch, and so you'll probably be hearing about that. So it's time now to welcome a few folks up to the front. There are a few people that are willing to say a couple words. I think maybe I'll just pick on Marty. He's here, and he's probably a willing. He said he'd say a word or two. We have a few folks who represent, maybe patients who have done very well or patients who have had challenges, and Marty has, I guess, in terms of Merkel, had both of those things, but for a long time and doing great now.
I am doing great. 12 years survivor since 2005. So I've really thought about what to say and what I could say to this group. In our support group this morning, I think it's a given that we all And just as important, because of the humble man that he is, we love his team. We recognize that. I think that could probably go unsaid, but I want to say it. What I want to talk about is the link between all of us. And I heard it over and over today in the support group, and that is the combination of three words, faith, hope, and charity. And I think what has happened with all of us in our life, that we have discovered that there's much more to life than our jobs. I shared, I'm a fire chief. I control things. I am a controller. I can shut down I-5. I have that authority.
You'd be very popular if you did that.
Yeah, I'm not very popular. I kind of hide when I do it, but when I went home after shutting I-5, I was kind of, sharing with my wife, and she asked me if I could go clean the bathroom. So she humbled me well. But I think that what we have found is that this cancer, I think I could speak for the majority of us, I would not take it away. We have all grown so much. We have learned so much about ourselves that suddenly we go from just living life, and life's a dream, to having our whole life turned upside down. We recognize how much our loved ones mean to us, and those things that maybe are not that important to us before, but are very important to us now. And so we suddenly develop this faith, faith in our doctors, faith in if we believe in a God, faith there. And then we develop that hope. We put that hope together with that faith in our doctors and in our beliefs. And then I think what's happened to all of us is we kind of turn charitable. We want to help others. And there wasn't one in the room, and I don't think there's one of us in this room that doesn't want to help somebody else that is going through what we have gone through. I used to say I really don't think I need to come to these meetings because I'm a 12-year survivor. I'm done. But I come because I want to help. I want to be part of that team that says there is a good life after MCC. So, when I'm asked, Marty, how you doing? My answer every time, I'm living the dream. I woke up this morning. God bless all of you and the team, and thank you.
Thanks, Marty. Rose? Yeah. So Rose is going to say a word. Thanks, Rose.
Yeah, right. I say more than words, right? I'm Rose Whitman. I'm from Kansas, and kind of hard to follow that. That's a great job. Guys, number one is I can't thank Dr. Neum, Dr. Batia, and the team so much as, I get goosebumps thinking about it. We got so fortunate. I had a sister-in-law who was a nurse in Arizona that said when she found out I had Merkel, of course, my doctor, when he called, told me, he said, don't Google it, you won't like it. And I was like, okay, so I Googled it, of course. And I said, ew, I don't like this. But I was scared to death, and within 2 days, she had every video that Dr. Neum and his team had ever made on my computer. And Jim and I sat and watched it Sunday evening, I remember. And the next day, she called me, she said, did you watch him? And I said, yeah, I watched him. And I said, what's all that mean? She says, you're calling Seattle today and getting in. And so I said, but I got to wait for a referral. No, you don't. So I called, I talked to Danielle, and you're right. She's that one that kind of kept me at ease and said, okay, can you be here in a week? And I'm going, oh, yeah, I can. So long story short, we came out and met with Dr. Neum, met with Dr. P, and we decided at the time that nobody in Kansas really knew a lot about Merkel. And I said, if I stayed in Kansas, it'd probably take me 3 or 4 weeks to get started on radiation. Who would you recommend? And he kind of was like, I said, if I stayed here in Seattle, I said, when could I start? He said, Monday. This is a Thursday. So I said, looks like I'm going to be in Seattle for a 6-week vacation. So, my radiation went super. I felt easy for me. People said, well, how was it? And I said, well, when they close the door and you have a 12-inch wall between you and them, I said, oh. But I said, my radiation lasted, I said I could say 3 Hail Marys, and I was done. And then I was on the streets of Seattle. So I kept moving. I'm a PE teacher and a coach, too. I've coached like 30-some years. And so unfortunately, my high school team at the time was kind of in disarray. They were pretty upset about it, but we made it through it, and it was really neat. I had such a huge outpouring of support from coaches and players all over Kansas that knew me. I'm pretty active in volleyball there, and every time we go to somebody's school, I was getting something or getting a check for something, and it was pretty amazing. And so the story with Dr. Neum and Erica is that I was all set to start a trial, and Jim and I came out in September, and I'd done all the preliminary stuff that Thursday and Friday. Sunday night, he calls me on my phone, Dr. Neum, and I'm going, oh, what's this about? And he says, well, you're coming in tomorrow, but he said, I'm afraid we're going to tell you probably aren't going to make it on the trial. And I was just like devastated. I was like, are you kidding? Why not? Because I'd found it here in my hip, gone to my throat, and he said, the one in your throat's not big enough. I said, not big enough? Are you kidding me? What is that about? I could feel it, And so sure enough, I didn't qualify for that particular trial. And Jim and I were just reminiscing with Dr. Batia this morning that we remember all of you sitting in that office, and he was Mr. Casual thinking, no big deal, And at the time, I didn't understand. But, boy, we got a new trial, and Erica was a lifeline for me. She was just awesome. She was my connection that kept saying, it'll happen, it'll happen. I got to tell a quick story on Erica. She's from Alabama or Georgia? Georgia. So she said, Rose, she said, there's other trials all over the United States, New York, California. I said, but Erica, I know you. I've been here for 6 weeks in Seattle. I know the bus system now, and I can get on the link and go somewhere, I'm a country girl here. But, and I can put up with I-5 traffic. Thank you very much. But she kept me going. I mean, she was, every week I would text her, say, okay, what's going on? Well, I finally got a text in, I think November, it said, the drug is here or been approved or whatever. So I came out and I was a T cell. They took my T cells and I did the avelumab. And it was just like, okay, let's do this. And so I got all that. I had 2 infusions of T cells. And then for a year, I came out every other week to get my avelumab. And I would fly out on a Sunday night from Kansas City. I would be here in the SCCA, 7 o'clock, bright and early on a Monday, see Dr. Batia, get my infusion, out the door. I was on the airplane. I was home by, sometimes 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning and back in school the next day. So I was like one of those lucky people who had no side effects. People didn't believe it. They said, really? My principal said, why don't you take Tuesday off? I said, I am jacked. I'm wired. I'm ready to go, So, on Tuesday morning, I said, Friday afternoon might be a different story. But through the whole year, I came out a year for every 2 weeks. And it was a real eerie feeling the first time that we didn't have to come back out on that second. I was like, oh, gosh. My safety net was getting on the plane and coming here. And I've had clear scans.
Yes. So congratulations, Rose. And
Thank
later,
you.
Kelly is going to talk about, how that trial worked and how we're learning from your and other patients, and that we're going to literally try and take your cure and transfer it to other people.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I will say the one thing. When people that in my school, my teachers come up to me, or if they have anybody, family member that gets cancer, they'll come to say, "What do you know about this?" And so I say, "Okay." Q2 gave me a real quick thing. She says, Google clinical trials. But I said when they start to say chemo, I just go, "Oh, don't." Is there immunotherapy out there that you can do? Sometimes, Salina's a town of 50,000 people, and we have our cancer center, but I think too often we don't have enough people that reach out. And I was fortunate to have a sister-in-law that said, no, you need to go to Seattle. And I was like, Seattle, really? But I sure am glad I did, and I cannot thank Dr. Neum and his staff. And getting to have our Monday morning visits with Dr. Batia every time I was out here was a real treat, and all the support staff is just unbelievable. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rose. Good. Monica, do you want to go?
So my husband is Greg Schimmel, and my son and I are here tonight because we want to continue with the work that he did for the MCC community, and we want to be of help, like Marty was saying. So a year after Greg was diagnosed with MCC, He came to SCCA when there was a reoccurrence of a tumor growth after he had surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. Greg had a single-mindedness in his approach to MCC, stop its growth, and live his life with enthusiasm and passion. He found the same single-mindedness in Dr. Neum and his team, and later Dr. Badia and his team. For 7.5 years, Greg was given the opportunity to be at the forefront of all the brilliant thinking, research, and treatment options that were available at SCCA and at UW. He also was the grateful recipient of support offered by various pharmaceutical firms who were offering cutting-edge treatment. He in turn made his contribution by participating in experimental trials and connecting with other patients and families through his work with the MCC support group. He was honored by the establishment of the Dr. Greg Schimmel Memorial Fund for MCC Research. We as his family are incredibly grateful for all the time he had to share with us, with his beloved music and tennis, with his patients, with his friends, and with everyone involved in this endeavor to take on MCC. We know how much all of you meant to him and how your strength strengthened him. He would want us to encourage all of you to continue with your single-minded challenge to this disease and to live life to the fullest like he did. Thank you.
Hayden, do you want to say something?
Hi. I kind of had to laugh when we came in because the last 2 years that we've come here, people think that I'm like the daughter of an MCC patient or the granddaughter. I was like, man, this is the first time I kind of match all the other patients, you know? So I, first of all, just wanted to thank you guys for attending this. It's been really cool for me to attend it the last 2 years and meet people because it's a rare community and it's hard to meet people. And I always just get so filled with joy and seeing everybody and the encouragement and the family that we have here. So thank you for making a point to come to this event, and thank you guys for putting it on for people like us. I got diagnosed 2 years ago, June of 2015. And since then, I've had 12 biopsies, 3 major surgeries, 2 rounds of radiation, 2 rounds of chemotherapy, 4 immunotherapies, and right now, I'm leaving the doctors scratching their heads like, what can we do next to this girl? My Merkel is super stubborn, and it's kind of funny, and I mean, it's not funny, but as I look around, because so many of you guys are doing so well, and I'm like the youngest, and I'm like, man, is it the whole like older, wiser thing? Is that why you guys are just kicking butt in this, and I'm just like sitting back here? So as I've thought about just some of the things that I've taken away from this journey, I kind of narrowed it down to 5 Fs. And it's not going to be the F word that everybody wants to say at one point in this journey. The first one is kind of like what Marty said, faith. For me, as a 23-year-old going through this and quite likely facing death, I have very often kind of sat back and been like, why do this? Why fight? It's hard. It's tiring. And you can kind of sit back, like Marty said, and look at your life and say, well, money fails you. Your job, it's not that great, like not great enough to go through all this for. Friends disappoint you, and sometimes family fails you. And so you kind of sit back and you say, what is there left? And for me, the constant has been my faith in God and just saying that is the thing that's kept me going through all that and being a 23-year-old. And so I really encourage you guys in that to have faith and keep faith, because that is one thing that won't leave you when a lot of other things might. So that's the first one. The second one, I'm going to kind of clump family and friends, because not everybody has a wonderful family. I've been very, very blessed to have such a wonderful support system and a husband. And he married me when he knew I had cancer, so. But I mean, I think it's kind of an obvious that we can't do this alone and that you need a support system. But I've been really challenged the last years to take it even further. And I've really learned the art of transparency. So I want to challenge you guys in that to really look at your loved ones and let them be there for you. It's hard. Cancer sucks. It really is hard. It's messy. It's ugly. You're a constant emotional basket case, roller coasters, and you shouldn't do that alone. And I know it's really uncomfortable, and sometimes it can be really, you kind of want to present your cancer in a nice, pretty box for your loved ones because you want to be strong for them or you don't want to be a burden. But I just challenge you guys to don't rob yourself of letting people truly be there for you, and don't rob them of having the opportunity. While we're experiencing one side of our cancer, your loved ones are spectators to your struggle, and they feel helpless. And I know that cancer for us patients can be isolating because you're like, well, no one understands, and I don't want to burden them. But break that wall and allow you to come together, and you will really be surprised at how it will really bring you guys together and not push you apart. We all struggle in one form, and it will be really, it's been life-changing for me to really, truly have people be there for me. I can just think of all the times where I've just sat there and cried for hours with my husband, Adam, and he's just sat there and just held me. There's been times where I have just screamed at the top of my lungs right next to my mom, and she's just held me. There's been times where I've called my grandma up and said, you know what, I just need to watch a movie and have some junk food, and can you just do that for me? And it's been so freeing for me to have the opportunity to allow people to be there in my mess. And it's been so awesome to see people who really have the heart and want to be there. So I just challenge you guys to let them do that. Okay, the next one, the next two are fight and focus. And I think it's kind of obvious that you're fighting for your life. So I don't really need to tell you to do that. But I do want to just take this opportunity, and this is not, they didn't ask me to do this. You guys know the team is completely humble and would never ask any of us to say anything nice about them, but you can't not. I just want to for those of you maybe who are new to the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance team, some of you have known them a long time and already know this then, but this team will give all of the fight and all of the focus to your care. And oh gosh, I mean, I've been here for 2 years, and I can't tell you how amazing it's been that no matter where I go in this facility, whether it was immunotherapy or radiation or chemo or that or this or that, I've been well cared for and cared to the point where they know my name. They know what I do for a living. They knew when I got married. You know, they know me and care about my life, and that's how they treat which blows my mind because they're just brilliant and they do so much in their whole day, but yet they know us each by name and know our story and know our case, and they will fight and focus everything they have. I've texted them on their personal days, Sundays. Hannah will text me back on a Sunday, and I'm like, girl, it's your day off. But they're that dedicated to us. So I just wanted to take the moment to just say thank you to all the team here for doing your utmost to save our lives. And obviously you're doing incredible work, and I can speak for all of us to say thank you for caring that much about us living. So anyway, thank you guys.
Thank you, everybody. I think that spans the gamut of the successes and the challenges that we've faced. And Obviously, both gives us reasons to be thankful and reasons to keep working really hard. I'd like to turn to one slide to tell you a couple things about Merkel cell carcinoma. Here's a picture of Friedrich Merkel, a German anatomist who in 1875 drew cells. Here he saw these cells in the bottom of the skin, and he called them touch sensors. We do not believe that modern Merkel cell carcinoma comes from those Merkel cells, but it ends up looking exactly like them. Therefore, it has gotten its name Merkel cell carcinoma. Here is the most recent data showing the increase in the incidence in this cancer. It's going up pretty rapidly, mostly because the baby boomers are getting older and they're entering into the time in their lives when they're at higher risk for this cancer. We believe that it's the immune system not quite working at its peak that increases the incidence like this. The risks are indeed age over 50, sun exposure, the Merkel virus, and immune suppression. And I will hasten to add that over 90% of Merkel patients don't have anything that we can tell is wrong with their immune system, but those who do have something profoundly wrong are at a significantly higher risk. This virus is all around us. Here's a couple folks in the lab just demonstrating that you can take a cotton swab on someone's normal, healthy skin, put that in a beaker and analyze it and find that this virus is present on our normal skin about half the time. It's on the doorknobs in the daycare centers. It is not doing anything that we can find that's wrong, except in about 1 in 3,000 people over their lifetime, it leads to Merkel cell carcinoma, causing about 80% of Merkel cell carcinomas, with the remaining 20% in the United States caused by sunlight. So here's a little quick summary of how this virus onto the skin or sunlight on the skin leads to this cancer. In the case of the virus, very rare events happen, and the virus actually integrates into some of our own DNA, and then then it starts to make little pieces of the virus that push the cells to divide. And an event then happens in which the immune system must be evaded by the cancer, because these little viral proteins necessary for the cancer to grow are very visible to most immune systems, and the immune system will get rid of the cancer in most cases. In contrast, the sunlight directly makes mutations in the genes in the skin, causes proteins to be abnormally produced and their functions to be altered. Again, very rare events, some of which are known, some of which are not known. And then again, immune evasion must happen because those UV mutated proteins should be visible to the immune system. So those are relevant points because of what we're going to talk about in terms of immune therapy later. We can re-engage the immune system in some cases. So I'm going to now shift to Krista, who's going to talk about the antibody test, and mention again that Krista deserves a round of applause because she did all the organization for this big event. Thank you, Krista.
Thank you, Dr. Neum. Can everyone hear me okay? A little shorter. As Dr. Neum mentioned, this is my third Merkel dinner of organizing, so it's been such a pleasure to meet so many new guests as well as the returning ones. It's always the highlight of my year, so thank you. Tonight I will talk to you about the antibody response in the body. So here is a blood vessel, and we have blood cells. This is a tumor cell, and then we have these little yellow Y shapes, and they're called antibodies. And antibodies are small proteins that float around in the blood, and we can measure these antibodies to detect early recurrences. Candace, a postdoctoral fellow in the lab, will then talk to you about the T cell response. And the T cells are actually responsible for fighting off the cancer. So Denise Galloway's lab, Kelly Polson, as well as many others, developed this antibody test in 2010. And this test became clinically available and is now known as the AMERC test, which many of you patients know, in 2014. UW Medicine runs this test weekly, and it's very complex. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty details, but here's just a schematic of a few of the 75 steps. This test takes about a day and a half of hands-on work and then a few extra days to validate those results and get them to you as patients. We found that this antibody test has been useful for all of our Merkel patients, and it really divides the patients into two groups. About half of our patients will produce the antibodies at the time of diagnosis, and for these patients, we can use this test to detect early disease. The other half of the patients will not produce the antibodies, and for these patients, we know that they're at a higher risk of having a recurrence, so you want to monitor them closer with more frequent scans and follow-up appointments. So how does the body respond to the Merkel virus? Dr. Neem already mentioned how the Merkel virus is all around us, but it takes a bunch of super rare events in order for a Merkel tumor to appear. So here's a patient that's developed a Merkel tumor on their head. And this patient's immune system will produce antibodies to that Merkel virus. And at the time of diagnosis, these antibody levels in the blood are high. After the patient is treated, indicated here by this Band-Aid, the antibody levels in the blood will then drop. If the patient develops a recurrence, shown here by this new tumor on the patient's chest, the antibodies in the blood will then rise again. So I want to give you a few clinical examples of how we use the antibody test. So here is a patient who did not have a recurrence. On the left side, we have antibody levels, and the bottom is time in years from diagnosis. And at the time of diagnosis, the patient produced high levels of antibodies, shown here by this red dot. After the patient was treated, the antibody levels dropped, and they continued to drop. Eventually, they plateaued, and this really provided reassurance for that patient and their clinical team that the cancer was not coming back. Here's a different patient whose cancer came back and how the antibody test caught it early. So at diagnosis, the patient produced moderate levels of antibodies, shown here, and the patient was treated, the antibody levels dropped, and for about a year, the patient was doing great and had no disease. Then the antibody levels increased. So we got this patient in for a scan, and sure enough, we saw new disease. We then were able to get this patient onto immunotherapy, which Candace will talk more about. And here in this blue bracket is that treatment time. So the patient was on immunotherapy for about a year, and during that time, the antibody levels dropped. Currently, after the treatment, the patient's antibody levels have continued to drop, and the patient is doing great without any evidence of disease. So in 2017, the lab, as well as a lot of other collaborators, published this validation study that tracked 219 patients' antibody responses and saw if the cancer was coming back or not. This was a huge collaborative effort. There were 19 authors. Leaders were Kelly Polson, Chris Lewis, Chihiro Morishima. And the takeaway message of this study was that for patients who had falling antibodies from the last blood test, 98% of those patients did not have a recurrence at that time. Alternatively, patients that had increasing antibodies from the last blood test, 88% of those patients had a recurrence at that time or later developed one. So in summary, this antibody test is making a huge difference for many of you and other Merkel patients. And the usage of this antibody test has increased when it became clinically available in 2014 with roughly 300 tests to 2017, where we're guessing there's going to be closer to 800 tests per year. And this annual usage is only going to increase. National guidelines for cancer doctors that will be published in 2018 will now newly list this antibody test as a way to detect new disease. And that's primarily based on that validation study that I mentioned before. And I really want to use this opportunity to say thank you to patient donations. You really keep this test running. We're able to track blood, give results really fast, as well as answer or ask interesting research questions about the antibody response and increase availability so you can get this test easier at your local doctor's office. So I'm now going to switch gears and hand the presentation to Dr. Candace Church, a postdoctoral fellow, who will talk to you about T cells and immunotherapy.
Thank you so much, Krista. That was a really nice summary of the AMERT test. Okay, so as Krista mentioned, I'm going to talk about T cells and immunotherapy. So one way that the immune system responds to the Merkel virus is through antibodies, but it can also see the Merkel virus or Merkel cell carcinoma with a T cell response. In this graphic here, you'll see killer T cells in blue, and you'll see that they're coming in to attack this red cancer cell with their little grenades. And so what exactly are killer T cells and how do they protect us? So if we were to take a sample of blood from someone in the room and take a close look, we would see all kinds of different killer T cells. And in this graphic here, each color is a T cell that can recognize a different target. And so the takeaway here is that killer T cells generally have the same parts and pieces, and they have the same function. They find a target and they eliminate it. They protect us against things like infections and cancer cells and bad guys. But they have one part that's distinctly different and very, very important. So if we were to zoom in on this little green killer T cell here, we would see that it has something called a T cell receptor. Now, this T cell receptor is pre-programmed for a very specific target. And so we like to use a fun analogy here to help explain the interaction between the T cell receptor and what it can see on the cancer cells. So I would like to propose that this is kind of like a tongue. This tongue is pre-programmed to like a very specific flavor, and this tongue happens to like a hot dog. It likes this very specific hot dog, this whole wheat bun, and hot dog that's wrapped in bacon. And we like to use this analogy. It's fun, right? We like to use this analogy because this hot dog bun has a very specific shape. It has a groove. And this groove can hold the hot dog very, very well. And on the cancer cell, there is a molecule called HLA. And HLAs are responsible for holding a piece of peptide. Here is a Merkel virus. So this is a piece of the Merkel virus that's inside the cell. And this is how it holds that piece of peptide so the T cell receptor can recognize and see that that is something that shouldn't be there and needs to be killed. So if we extend this example to, say, another type of infection, say this killer T cell here, this purple guy, recognizes a flu-infected cell. And here's the HLA holding a piece of the flu virus. This purple tongue represents the purple T cell receptor, and it's very specific for the Seattle dog. So this is a very fancy hot dog. It has very specific toppings on it. It's a white bun. It's got cream cheese on it. It has, I think, mustard and some jalapenos. So this tongue only sees this hot dog. So this is a really important concept because this allows a killer T cell to be very specific for one little thing and go out and protect you. And so how does it do that? Well, these T cells go through your body kind of like little soldiers. They go around and they survey the area and they look for people or invaders that shouldn't be there. And when they see a target, they become activated. And once they become activated, they multiply and turn themselves into a little army of soldiers and go and kill their target. So that's basically the concept of a killer T cell. And that's great and all, but does that matter for Merkel cell carcinoma? And from what you've heard earlier, we believe it does. So this is observations first made by Kelly Paulson when she did her PhD in Paul's lab, and you'll hear from her in a little bit. But her observation was really key in that people who have killer T cells in their tumor do very well. So this top bar on this graph here shows 100% Merkel cell carcinoma specific survival, meaning that if you had a lot of T cells in your tumor, you did very well. And so this graphic here shows skin on top, tumor on bottom, and lots of these black dots which represent T cells. In people who had T cells that were either stuck at the edge of the tumor or not in the tumor at all, they didn't do as well. So this was very important, a very, very important finding. And you know, it begs the question, what exactly are those T cells seeing in the tumor? Are they actually seeing the Merkel virus? So to answer this question, we take advantage of the very unique specificity between the tongue or the T cell receptor on the killer T cell and that hot dog bun. So we can synthetically make these molecules in the lab, this hot dog bun combination, and then make a complex with a nice label on it that we can visualize so we can measure and study these killer T cells. So there's 4 copies of the hot dog bun and the label, and because there's 4, we call these tetramers. So this is work that was done in collaboration with Dr. David Cole's lab, where tumors were biopsied and blood also, and T cells were isolated from the blood and the biopsies, and they were labeled with these tetramers. And you can see here from this graph, people who don't have Merkel cell carcinoma have 0% Merkel virus T cells. But people who do have Merkel cell carcinoma often have T cells that recognize the Merkel virus. This was a very exciting finding, but it also begs the question, if you have Merkel-specific T cells, why do you still have Merkel cell carcinoma? So if you have virus-specific T cells, why aren't they working? Well, as it turns out, Merkel cell carcinoma really doesn't want to be eliminated by the immune system and has found a way to kind of block the killer T cells from working. In this graphic, you'll see a T cell on one side here, and this T cell has its T cell receptor or tongue, and this is the tumor on the other side, and this is its hot dog bun. So this is a T cell that's specific for this particular tumor, but because this T cell has this molecule called PD-1 on its surface, the tumors figure out a way to engage that PD-1 through PD-L1. And when it does that, it causes the T cell to become exhausted. And when the T cell is exhausted, it can't do its work eliminating this tumor cell. So what we can do is use these new immunotherapy drugs to try and block this interaction, and blocking this interaction stops this exhaustion process in the T cell and then re-engages effector functions, so the T cell or the tumor cell then dies. So there's a couple of ways that we can target and block this interaction. You can block it from the PD-1 side with Keytruda or pembrolizumab, and you can block it with Opdivo or nivolumab. And you can block it on the PD-L1 side with Bavencio or avelumab. So I'd like to show you some clinical trial data that shows pembrolizumab treatment. And in this graph, each bar represents a patient. If the bar goes up, the patient's tumors grew. If the bar goes down, the patient's tumors shrunk. And so you can see here that we had several patients whose tumors grew, but many patients whose tumors shrunk. And what's really important to take away from this is the purple bars are patients who had virus-positive tumors. The orange bars are patients that had virus-negative tumors. So we're very excited that this immune therapy works in both virus-negative and virus-positive patients. And also this therapy is better than chemotherapy, has longer-lasting effects and fewer side effects, but only about half of MCC patients will really have long-lasting benefits from this. So what are ways that we can address that and help make the half less than half? We can help killer T cells function better. So we can make tumors more visible to T cells. We can provide help to the killer T cells. And we can find T cells with stickier tongues that are better at fighting MCC. And so I'm going to start with the first one here. So what do I mean by making tumors visible to T cells? Well, remember that hot dog and bun that's on the surface of tumor cells? They can downregulate it, and 80% of MCCs hide this way. However, using interferon or radiation, we can then upregulate the hot dog and bun. And this is something that's actually already being used in the clinic. And Kelly Paulson's going to tell you a little more how we're combining this with some other immune therapies to help the killer T cells work better. Another way we can do this is to provide help to the killer T cells. And this is work from Natalie Vandeven, who's an MD PhD student in the lab, where we're zooming in on the MCC tumor here. And if we have killer T cells in there, that's great. But what if they're not already in the tumor? What if they're out in the body surveying, looking for their target? Well, a helper T cell can help them get into the tumor by making factors that attract the killer T cells into the tumor and help support their growth. And then you get many killer T cells that are specific for the MCC tumor that make little grenades that go in and kill the tumor. These helper T cells are very few, so it's very difficult to study them, and Natalie Vandeven has worked quite hard to come up with new technologies in many collaborations to study them. So we're making headway here and hoping that this will be able to help our patients. Also, we can find T cells with stickier tongues, which are better at fighting MCC. So this is work done by Natalie Miller, an MD PhD student from the lab, and she wanted to know, for a specific hot dog bun combination, how many different tongues are there? And she found there are many different tongues, in fact, hundreds of different tongues that will recognize the same target. So if there's so many different tongues, do they have differences in how well they do their job? And the short answer is yes. So the stickiness of a tongue, what does that mean? So you have a tongue here that might be very good at doing its job, meaning that it doesn't need very many copies of the hot dog bun to recognize a tumor cell and kill it. So that makes it a sticky tongue, makes it good at its job, and as you recall, tumor cells like to reduce the number of the HLA and peptide on their surface or hot dog buns. So if you have a sticky tongue, hopefully it's better at killing the Merkel cell carcinoma. So in green here we have very sticky tongues, and in red here we have less sticky tongues, and these are representative of different flavored T cells. And when you look at the clinical data for the T cells from which these patients came, the very sticky tongues tend to come from patients who are still alive and have no evidence of disease. However, tongues that are less sticky come from patients who might not have done so well. So how can we take advantage of these very sticky tongues for other patients? Well, we can take them out of those cells and we can isolate them and put them in other cells. Say a patient who has T cells that don't have very sticky tongues or no tongues for the Merkel virus at all. We can make them express those tongues, and then we can grow them in the lab and infuse them into patients to help fight their Merkel cell carcinoma. So this is work being done at Aude Dupuis's lab in collaboration with Phil Greenberg, and Kelly's also going to tell you more about this. So to review, the 3 ways that we're working on improving killer T cell function is to make the tumors more visible to T cells, increasing the hot dogs and buns, providing help to killer T cells with helper T cells, and finding T cells with stickier tongues, which are better at fighting MCC. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Kelly Paulson, who's going to tell you about very exciting current and future T cell trials.
All right. Thank you very much, Candace and Krista, for the lovely talks. It's so exciting to get to be here tonight. As many of you know, this is my 12th year with Team MCC, and I've recently moved down the street to Aude Dupuis's lab, where I see patients with her at the Bezos Immunotherapy Clinic, and we form your cellular immunotherapy team doing T-cell therapies. I'm really delighted tonight to tell you about our current T-cell trials and what's coming down the pipeline for 2018. So when we think about immune responses, we can think about an immune response like a fire, burning up the firewood that's the tumor. And you can think of the kindling being that connection between the HLA peptide and the T cell, bringing that fire down to the tumor so it can attack it and eat it up. And that fire needs to be burning at just the right level. If we don't have a strong enough fire, we're not going to burn up the firewood and the tumor can grow. And if we have too strong of a fire, we can have side effects from our immunotherapy and immune-related toxicities that can be a struggle for our patients. You can think about drugs like avelumab or pembrolizumab or nivolumab or any of these checkpoint inhibitors as fanning the flames. And so in some situations, these drugs work really well. So you think about this smoldering ember of a T-cell response, you fan it with one of the checkpoint inhibitors, and it turns into a big, beautiful, roaring campfire, eradicates the tumor, patient does really well, and we're all really happy. However, in other cases, these drugs don't work as well. And so if you're fanning the flames, but there's no spark there, we can't get that fire going. And so we hypothesize that in these patients where the checkpoint inhibitor drugs aren't getting the regressions that we hope for and know are possible, that what we need to do is add on a T-cell spark of T-cells that specifically recognize the Merkel cell carcinoma tumor and add that on to the drugs to fan the flames and make the immune response stronger. When we give our T-cell therapies, we give them as a combination that we call triple therapy. And that's because there's 3 important pieces. We want to address this system from the top to the bottom. So we start out by making that tumor more visible to the immune system. So we're going to throw the kindling on. We're going to put the hot dogs on the bun and the cell surface. We're going to either inject the tumor with something or radiate it to make it more visible to the immune system so that when we light our match, there's something ready to go. Then we're going to put in our T cells, which are specific T cells recognizing the Merkel cell cancer in current trials, recognizing Merkel cell polyomavirus, to light that fire, and we're going to immediately follow them with an IV immunotherapy drug to fan the flames and turn that into a brisk T cell response. We make our T cells for our patients in 2 ways. The current way that we're doing it is we actually expand a patient's own virus-specific T cells. So we take someone, we hook them up to a big machine. It looks like a dialysis machine. They get a large IV in the arm. We collect the cells over several hours, and then we have to grow them up in the dish. And we grow them up for weeks and weeks in the dish. It takes somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks. Lots of flasks, big tanks. It's very labor intensive. And what we get at the end of the day is 10 billion virus-specific T cells from that person to put back into them to fight their cancer. Now, this works very well for some patients, and those are patients that have pre-existing T cells that recognize the Merkel cell polyomavirus well and are very sticky. But it's harder to grow these cells, or impossible to grow these cells from other individuals. And that's why we're moving to a new way of making T cells that we call the transgenic way. And what we're doing with this is we're learning the pattern for a sticky tongue, and we're creating a new T cell in a patient that's got the business end or the winning part of somebody else's effective T cell combined with their own T cell therapy. And we do this importantly because we can do it faster. We can do it between 2 and 3 weeks. We can do it cheaper because there's less labor involved in making the cells. And importantly, we can do it better because we're giving a winning, known, proven T cell receptor. For this type of treatment to work, the HLA type of the patient and the recipient needs to match. It's what we call a semi-custom therapy. Our T cell therapy trials are expensive. It's an individualized treatment. There's a high regulatory burden. There's a substantial commitment of our patients to enroll in these trials, both in time, in travel, in giving us the biopsies and blood samples that we need. Plus, they are taking a risk to enroll in first-in-man trials, and we are so grateful for their participation and their trust in us to participate in these studies. Therefore, we're using the new technologies, the best and the brightest, absolutely cutting-edge things to learn the most that we can out of the precious samples. Our failures infuriate us. We want to know why those cells didn't work. Hayden, there's a dent in Dr. Chapuis's wall where I kicked it when I learned that your T cells didn't stick. And so we want to take what we can to learn from the patients where the T cells are less effective or only work for a period of time and understand how we're going to make it better for those patients and for the next patients. And then we have some patients that are winning. They're doing really well. You heard from one of them earlier tonight. And in these patients, we want to learn what their T cells did to win, and we want to copy, cut and paste the winning pieces of those T cells to give them to other people to make their T cells work better. So I'm going to tell you about 3 cases that illustrate the challenges and successes in our T cell therapy. And I'm going to tell you about some of these new cutting edge techniques that we're doing to learn more about how the T cells are working and how we can make them better. This first case is a case of a 59-year-old gentleman who received his triple therapy after having received multiple previous treatments for his Merkel cell carcinoma, over 5 previous therapies. And he had a response to his T cell therapy that lasted for over a year. I'm going to walk you through the slide in a moment. And then the T cells stopped working. And so our big question was why? So this is looking at the patient's timeline. So this is day 0, the day we put the T cells in. And this is looking at the amount of Merkel cell cancer that he had. And he had Merkel cell cancer all the way from his head, from behind his eyes, all the way down to the lower leg, to the toes. So he had what we call a large burden of Merkel cell cancer. And so we gave the T cells along with some radiation and followed immediately thereafter by the immune therapy drugs. And it actually took several months for the immune response to get going. But once the immune response got going, there was a period of shrinkage of the tumor where the tumor shrank by over 90%. They shrank behind the eye, they shrank on the leg, patient was feeling much better, things were going very well. And we looked in the blood and we could see the T cells that we put in there, and we were all feeling pretty good because the patient was feeling well, the tumors were nearly gone, and everything looked like it was going all right. And then he showed up in clinic one day and he had this thing on his leg that looked like a bug bite. And the question was, is that a bug bite? And unfortunately, it wasn't a bug bite. It was the Merkel cell cancer coming back. And shortly thereafter, his tumor started growing back very quickly, and he ultimately passed away of his disease. Interestingly, when we looked at this situation and we said, were the T cells there at the time that the tumor was coming back? The T cells were still there. And we said, okay, well, how about the HLA? How about the hot dog buns? Are they there? They were there. And we said, what about the epitopes? What about the hot dogs? Did he lose the epitopes? Did he lose the virus? And he had it. And so now we were really stumped. Did these T cells that we put in work? They're still there. Why does he have cancer? And why did this Merkel cell cancer, which had been in remission for a year in response to our immunotherapies, decide to grow back? So we used a brand new technology called single-cell RNA sequencing to look at thousands of cells at once in order to understand the immune response when it was successful and to understand how the cancer got around the immune response. So how this works is we collect blood or we biopsy the tumor. We run it on this $150,000 machine that looks like a toaster, has one button, $150,000, and it takes cells on a single card that's about a credit card size and gives each and every cell in that sample its own special label. We then sequence every gene that's expressed in each of up to 10,000 cells at once. We do it on this thing. We get 250 million sequences. My mind is blown every time I get the results of one of these back for about $3,000. We do some advanced computing. We need our biostatistical colleagues to help us make sense of all of that data. And we finally end up with this plot called a Tisney plot. And the program is called Seurat. And I love this because just like the French Impressionist painting, when you look at one individual dot, it's difficult to make sense of what's going on. And in this case, each dot is a cell. But when you back up, you can see the scene. And so like you can see the sailboat over here we can see our T cells, and the tree over here, we can see the B cells or the antibody-making cells. And we can understand every cell in that sample in context. So the first thing we did is we looked at this patient's blood to understand what was going on with the T cells when the treatment was working, and what kind of cell was mediating that response. So when we looked in the peripheral blood of the patient, we could see many different kinds of white blood cells. We could see the killer T cells here, the CD8 T cells. We could see the helper T cells here in blue. We could see the natural killer cells. Some of you are probably on the natural killer cell trial. We could see the monocytes and macrophages, and we could see the antibody-making cells. So all these different kinds of white blood cells. And we said, of these many kinds of white blood cells that we can look at, what changed when the cancer was shrinking? What cell was doing the job? And we saw, well, when we looked, the cell that was really different were these red ones over here. And so we went back to say, what kind of cells are these red ones? And these red ones were a very activated subset of those CD8 killer T cells. And so we said, okay, killer T cells were mediating the treatment response. And so then we went to look at the tumor. And this is fancy microscopy. It's 6-color microscopy. It lets us look at the tumor and the immune cells all at the same time on the same slide, getting 6 times the information from a single biopsy. And here the tumor is shown in blue and the killer T cells are shown in green. Before the patient got his immunotherapy, we can see that the tumor is what we call cold. There was no fire there. There was no T cell spark. But instead, when we went and we looked at that tumor at the time that it was shrinking and our immunotherapy was working, that tumor was studded with those killer CD8 T cells. And they were there and they were attacking the tumor. And in data that I'm not showing you, we were able to show that they were activated and they were the cells that we put into him, that we infused into his body. We went back to look at the tumor again when it was growing back and to see whether those T cells were still there. And although we could see the CD8 T cells in the blood, the killer T cells in the blood, the tumor had once again gone cold, showing us that it was getting around these killer T cells, and they were really the ones that had eradicated the tumor. So now I've answered the first of my questions, which is whether the T cells work. And yes, they absolutely did. But I still haven't told you how this tumor learned to get around them after being kept at bay for them by over a year. And so next we turned to doing the same kind of technique, but on the tumor sample itself. And so this is looking at over 7,000 cells at once. And when we look at a cancer that's escaping the immune system, the question is it the cancer cells that are doing it? Or are the cancer cells sitting in a bad neighborhood that's not letting those T cells in? And so because this technique lets us look at all kinds of cells, it allowed us to ask the question of what cells were the ones that were responsible for the escape from the immunotherapy. And in this type of a graph, cells that are similar to each other or pile on top of each other, and cells that are dissimilar from each other that have changed go far apart. And when we looked at the neighborhood cells were all on top of each other. Okay? So here's all of the neighborhood cells. So they didn't change much. It wasn't the neighborhood. But let's look at the tumor cells. Here's the tumor cells before the immunotherapy and the tumor cells after. And they've changed a lot. So the tumor cells were the bad actors, and they were the ones deriving that escape from our T-cell immunotherapy. So what did they do? So when you look at any given cell, including a tumor cell, they express multiple flavors of hot dogs and buns. You can think of here, this HLA, this is a HLA-A, and I'm showing it as a yellow bun. And this HLA is HLA-B, and it's an orange bun. When we give T cells, we give them in flavors, and each individual flavor can taste only one bun. And so in this patient's case, the T cells that he received could only taste HLA-B. So when we looked before the T cell immunotherapy, we saw that the tumor expressed HLA-A, or the yellow buns that were not seen by the T cells we put in, and HLA-B, or the orange buns, which were targeted by the T cells that we put in. But when we looked at the tumor that had grown back after the immune therapy, after having responded for a year, we saw that the reason it was able to grow back is that it lost expression of the flavor of bun recognized by the T cells that we put in. So this provided further evidence that those T cells were mediating the regression, explained one of the ways that the tumor got around the immune cells after having responded for a year, and gave us an immediate next step for how we could make this treatment better of why can't we put in T cells that recognize HLA-A and HLA-B at the same time? Can we make it better? So we've given 2 patients triple therapy, including 2 flavors of T cells, and I am delighted to tell you that both of them are alive and well with no evidence of their Merkel cell cancer more than 18 months after having started this treatment. The first of these patients you've heard from tonight, and here's just a picture of her scans. These are some of the folks that are involved in the trial, Dr. Chapuis, Dr. Bhatia, and of course Dr. Niyam, all working together on the clinical team here. Here's the radiated lesion that we had radiated to put the kindling on the fire, to put the hot dogs and buns up on the surface of the cell. And here are some non-radiated lesions also shrinking and gone. The second patient who received 2 flavors of T cells plus the triple therapy came onto the trial after a time that we had funding from EMD Serono to do serial biopsies. And the patient kindly allowed us to put a needle into a tumor on 3 separate occasions and get 3 small pieces of the tumor before treatment while the tumor was shrinking. And then on a 3rd occasion when there actually wasn't any tumor left but in the spot that the tumor used to be. And we were able to see through these serial biopsies that the T cells that we put in, and we put in about 20 flavors of 2 specificities, that they had been undetectable before our treatment. We put them into the peripheral blood, and they localized, they homed in right into the tumor. And we were able to see 9 of the 20 of flavors of T cells we put in right there in the shrinking tumor, both a higher number of flavors and at higher level than in the peripheral blood, suggesting that those T cells are going exactly where we want them to go. And importantly, after all that tumor was gone, there were still some of those T cells. One of the clones was hanging out there like a sentry, helping to defend against the cancer coming back. So now we know that we've got T cells. They're going to the right place. They're causing shrinkage of the tumors. And these T cells have a pattern, and that's their T cell receptor. We call that the CDR3. And once you learn the pattern, you can remake that T cell in anybody that has the same hot dog bun type. So if they have the virus and they have the hot dog bun type, we can get T cells from you, and using what we call transgenic technology, we can recreate that T cell in you. And it's been very difficult to do this in the past because it's really hard to learn the pattern. Because if you think of the pattern like a dress, the skirt is on one chromosome and the jacket is on the other chromosome, and we can't get information from both. So we could learn the jacket or we could learn the skirt, but we couldn't make the full dress, and so we couldn't recreate the T cells. Earlier this year in May, we became the world's first commercial users of a new technology called 10x VDJ that we are using to be able to read the whole pattern of the T cell in individual patients. And we're focusing on T cells that eradicated Merkel cell carcinoma tumors, these winning T cells, to learn the pattern from these winning T cells so that we can recreate these T cells in other people. And our goal is to share cures with as many patients as possible, to make as many of these TCRs as possible so that we can recreate them in other patients to give them a robust T cell response if they don't have one to begin with. We have a protocol in development called 9845, or the ATTACK MCC regimen. This is coming, hopefully in September 2018, for patients that need more than standard immunotherapy. The acronym stands for ATTACK, so autologous means from yourself, but transgenic, so it's carrying somebody else's winning piece. T cells, combined with avelumab, which we're using as our immune booster to fan the flames, and class 1 HLA upregulation are kindling to make that tumor more visible. This is a complicated slide with our proposed schematic, and this is a slide of a T cell stopping a cancer cell. So in summary, T cells combined with immunotherapy is a highly promising strategy for eradicating MCC. We know that the T cells that we're putting into patients are going into the right places and they're helping mediate tumor regressions. And in data that I haven't shown you, they've also proven their ability to recruit friends, which is important for a long-term immune response. It seems clear to us that putting in 2 types of T cells is going to be better than putting in 1 type of T cell. And so right now we are furiously working at isolating winning TCRs from patients with immunotherapy responses with the hopes of sharing cures with others. We need a lot of these TCRs in order to reach the most possible patients, and we thank you for your participation in our research efforts, agreeing to blood draws, biopsy, for your travel to come here, family support, and then also the financial support of our donors. We hope to have this next generation ATTACK T-cell trial to you in mid to late 2018. And really, we're very excited for the potential for cellular immunotherapy combined with these new powerful drugs to mediate long-term MCC control. So it's been a long evening, and we're now about 25 minutes over, so I thank you all for your attention, and I'm bringing you to the most exciting slide of the evening. It's dessert time. Paul, I'll let you take over here.
A little bit of energy there and a few ideas. Yeah. We'll take it. We can use all the energy we can get. The battle is not trivial. So everybody can head up to get dessert and coffee. With the exception of Team Merkel, we're going to have our annual photo here. Here's our first one of these from last year. So I'll ask the folks who are over in the Brotman building to come on over here, the members of Team Merkel, and we're just going to take a picture down here amongst the confetti. And we thank you all for coming. Enjoy dessert, and thanks for the support making this progress possible.